This morning and part of the afternoon is about Northern Connection, so it's going to be a bit of a chance to hear some of the stories and projects happening in the north, and we're going to start with a plenary from myself and Jen Silcock. Jen, there you are.
Do you want me to come up?
Yeah, that would be great. Did you want to introduce me?
I don't know, how are we going to do this?
There you go.
I can introduce
So I'm
you.
the chair for this session, and we're actually going to introduce each other, and then I'll hand over to Jen.
You can tell we've practiced this a lot. So I'm going to introduce you. Yeah, righto, Paul. So this is Paul Donaghue. He manages the Queensland Threatened Plant Network. He has worked for WWF, Greening Australia, Queensland National Parks Association, Griffith University and Healthy Land and Water. Apart from species recovery, Paul's fields of interest include ecological restoration, fire ecology, landscape ecology, and the management and preservation of cultural landscapes. Paul has also completed a Churchill Fellowship that examined how 5 national agencies in Europe, the USA and South Africa were dealing with climate impacts on protected areas. In his spare time, Paul can be found wandering the bush, adding to his personal visual herbarium. How many species are you up to now, Paul?
A few.
Yeah, I believe it's in the 2000s somewhere. It's very, very impressive. And we've been enjoying a lot of Paul's photos on the slides during the conference. Gardening, reading, or wrangling his 2 daughters, not necessarily in that order. There you go. Do you want to introduce me now?
Absolutely,
All right.
yeah. So Jen is a research fellow with the School of Environment at the University of Queensland. She's researched and published widely on threatened species, rangeland ecology, desert wetlands, ethnobotany and landscape history over the past 20 years. She led the National Action Plan for Australia's Imperiled Plant Species 2021 and serves on various committees and scientific reference groups, including the Queensland Species Technical Committee and the Publications Committee for the International Rangelands Congress 2025. I just want to say it's been a real pleasure to work with Jan since I started in this role, and it's been a growing partnership, and we're really happy today to be able to bring to you the plenary session, which is on saving Queensland's rarest species. I'll hand over to Jen first.
Thanks, Paul. I can never work these things, so we'll just bear with me. Thanks everyone for coming, and I'd just like to start with acknowledging all the countries that we've all come from, and particularly the traditional custodians of these lands that we're here on and meeting on. I grew up between Jandowie and Pittsworth, not far from here, so this is a bit of like coming home for me, and I've just found it so, seeing talks like we've seen from Paul and Ollie, and it's just been a really special place to be here and listening to all these talks. That's an outline of where we're going to take you today. Paul said I didn't have to focus too much on this slide, so we'll just get into it. But that's basically where we're going. I'm going to give you an overview of Queensland's threatened plant species. It's going to be pretty broad and pretty brief, but we're just going to set the scene about where we're at with threatened plant conservation in Queensland, and then Paul's going to take the stage and talk through some examples of how we've been working with local communities to protect some of these plant species. So 78% of Queensland's listed threatened species are plants. So we're looking at over 1,000 listed plants in Queensland, which is more than 7% of our total vascular flora. I'm not sure if there's any fungi people or non-vascular plant people in the room, but there's actually 1 macrophyte listed and no fungi listed, which doesn't reflect the fact they're not threatened. It just reflects the state of our knowledge. I've done these talks before, and there's always someone who comes up afterwards and says, "What about fungi?" And I'm like, I love fungi, but there are no listed ones because we just don't know enough about them. In terms of the plants that are listed, as of when I was putting this talk together last week, there's 141 are critically endangered, 230 are endangered, about 400 vulnerable, and 253 near threatened, which is a Queensland only category. That's through the Nature Conservation Act, and obviously Tegan's talked about how the EPBC Act at the national level is currently being aligned with the Queensland list. 70% of those are endemic to Queensland, so don't live in other states. The rest of them, some of them occur in the wet tropics in Cape York and then into Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and others occur down into New South Wales and the Northern Territory. The plants I've got there are all locals to the Darling Downs. They live in grasslands just out to the west of here, sort of between Oakey and Bowenville, and those big grasslands that have been cleared, there's only about 1% left of them, and mostly on the main highway, the Warrego Highway heading west from here. Although I did just hear that thistle there that used to be called Stemacantha and Raponticum, it's apparently a population outside McDonald's, just about a kilometre from the conference venue that a friend of mine just told me about. So, that it is pretty close to here. Hopefully we can find it. That's just, sorry about the arrows here. Paul was less than impressed, and so was I really, but I thought I'd have to show people where these bioregions are. But the point here is that Queensland's threatened plant species are concentrated in a couple of bioregions. So the wet tropics and southeast Queensland together have the vast majority of threatened species. It's also a lot down in the southern Brigalow belt where we are now. That's the bioregion. We're sort of on the eastern edge of that bioregion now, and also up in Cape York Peninsula. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there's a huge amount of country out in the west, the Channel Country, Mulgalands, Mitchell Grass Country, that doesn't have that many threatened plant species. It used to have more, but I spent about 10 years out looking for them, and a lot of them have come off the list because they were fairly common and not threatened. In terms of habitats, I guess this links back to what Steve was talking about yesterday. We've got the rainforest where about half of our threatened species live in some sort of rainforest, including dry rainforests. But then there's this huge number, nearly 300 species that live on rock outcrops or mountains or cliffs. Those outcrops that Steve was talking about in Western Australia, turns out they're equally important over here as well. And, eucalypts and woodlands and those, dominant places in our rainforests are the red bits in that big vegetation map of Queensland. So you can see they occupy such a tiny proportion of Queensland, but they're home to, half of our threatened species. Conversely, eucalypt woodlands are super widespread. We all know what they look like. We've all been in them. There's actually not that many threatened species that are associated with them. Wetlands, also a tiny proportion of the landscape, but relatively large numbers of threatened species, and quite a lot of our threatened species can actually survive and thrive in some cases in non-remnant and regrowth vegetation as well. About 80% of our threatened species have at least some populations in the conservation estate, but over half also have some populations on private land, which is mostly agricultural land, and about 10%, which is quite a lot, are restricted to these narrow roadside remnants and small council reserves and places like that. So in terms of the state of our knowledge, how am I going for time? I don't want to take Paul's time away. So 13 species were listed as presumed extinct, but when we had a really close look at that through the NEST project a couple of years ago, in one of those papers there, actually most of them have pretty doubtful occurrences in Australia. There's some of them that may never have occurred here, and a lot of the others haven't actually been surveyed for adequately to say that they're extinct. So there's actually no Queensland plants that were assessed as likely or probably extinct, which is pretty amazing when you think about the state of our fauna, right? We've lost so many animal species, but plants, we've got this amazing opportunity to have a relatively intact flora at a species level. In saying that, there's about nearly 30 that haven't been seen for more than 50 years, and nearly 200 that haven't been collected for more than 20 years, which is like a pretty long time, a couple of decades. How are they going? We don't really know. 400 plants are known from less than 10 collecting records, so pretty sparse occurrences. And We don't have any real data. We know that they were there at some point in time, but we don't have any data about the threats and their population trends and how they're going. And most plants in Queensland have really limited or no targeted search effort. We suspect a lot are declining. 285 are suspected to be declining. That's a really rough figure. It's probably more. And we just really don't know. So really briefly, a lot of the work I've done in the last 15 or 20 years has been surveying plants, threatened plant species out in the desert, the Channel Country and Mulga Country, Mitchell grass. There was heaps of plants out there that were only known from 4 or 5 or less records and just hadn't been seen for many decades. Once I started looking, and I was really lucky that I had really good seasons in the early 2010s, these plants were like, some of them, this Xerothamnella is the one on the map there. It was known from just a few records, hadn't been collected for years, listed as vulnerable nationally. It turned up, I think we estimated there's probably about 30 to 50 million plants out there. It's subsequently been delisted. So those dots there are where I went looking for a rare species, are the green dots, and where I found one are the yellow stars. So we've just started doing a bit more of this process in the Brigalow Belt, and just the last school holidays I was out looking for plants up in the state forest country, sort of to the northwest of here, and there's 2 micromyrtices on those slides. The sort of spidery. I was trying to do my Anyway, there's a spidery looking one there. It turned out to be everywhere. There's another one that turned out to be quite rare. So every species is going to have its own story, and we just really need to get out there and have a good look for them. Threats, we all know what these are, but amazingly, ongoing habitat loss is still a threat in this developed country we live in 2024, which is kind of nuts. Weeds, feral pigs, inappropriate disturbance regimes are so poorly understood. They're a listed suspected threat for nearly every species, and we don't really know how they operate. We need targeted surveys. And then you have these ones like myrtle rust that just kind of come out of nowhere and catch us totally unawares. And there's a heap of species that are threatened with pretty imminent extinction because they can't reproduce in the face of myrtle rust. And we'll hear some more talks about that later on in the conference. And climate change, we've heard about this. It's a massive suspected threat for lots of species, and we don't really know how it's going to play out and what sort of adaptations the flora is going to have. And also it's not just about lists. So there's a heap of species that are not listed, they're widespread, they're pretty common, they seem to be doing fine. When you go out and do demographic transects through their populations, you don't find any young ones at all. So we've got a lot of narrow range endemics on our list that are listed under IUCN criteria sort of B and D because they've got a limited range, but there's a heap that are really widespread that are declining because they're not recruiting. Some of them are listed. We've got the Uline tree there, which just goes out west of here and north of here. It is listed, but still relatively widespread, but it's so rare that you see a young one. And the same as the iconic Queensland bottle tree. Our grandkids might not see those trees. You never see a seedling of a Queensland bottle tree. And there's a heap of arid zone trees and shrubs, a lot of really important medicine plants and cultural plants that have no recruitment at all in the current grazed landscape. So it's not just about what's listed. There's a whole heap of other things we need to be thinking about as well for the Queensland flora. That's me done. Your turn, Paul.
Thanks so much, Jen. So we're going to do a bit of a switch now. I had a lot of thoughts that I tried to organise and put into this presentation, so bear with me as I try to get through them all. So for my contribution to this plenary, I really wanted to concentrate on the how and why of community groups and environmental groups, are integral to recovering and protecting threatened plant species. And to use this analysis as a bit of a prism to describe some of the key activities of the Queensland Threatened Plant Network. In doing so, I hope to elevate, in your minds, the vital role that these groups play in the protection and conservation of some of the rarest plants in this state, and to think about the ways in which we can actually improve collaboration. So working with community groups involves many steps. It's certainly not a linear process, it's much more three-dimensional, and there are many potential pitfalls along the way. Some of the key considerations with working with community groups include the ones that you can see on the slide at the moment. I want to say that none of this information is new, and actually most of it is intuitive. However, being aware of these considerations is one of the keys to unlocking successful plant conservation projects. So with this in mind, what do community-based environmental groups bring to the conservation table? Firstly, they are connected to and embedded within their local community. They have ownership of what happens locally, and they bring a perspective to threatened plant conservation that is uniquely informed by a lifetime of living locally, dealing with local issues, habitats, and landscapes. They nurture and sustain relationships within their community. That is, they know and work with land managers, landholders, traditional owners, and community leaders. They create community education opportunities in schools. They have access to local community events and social media groups, and they can call upon these relationships to undertake conservation work. In this regard, they are able to create a legacy of engagement and on-ground work that often spans decades, and we heard some of that from Carol yesterday. An important extension of this role is their ability to represent, include, and balance the needs of different sectors, and that's one of the key roles that groups play. They are there for the long term because they invest themselves locally. They provide sustained voluntary input into projects over long periods of time. So these inputs may oscillate, and there are some great examples, particularly the Stanthorpe Rare Wildflower Consortium, which was founded in 2004, and Treat, the Trees for the Evelyn and Atherton Tablelands, which was started actually over 40 years ago. They provide the perfect vehicle to conduct long-term monitoring of threatened plant populations because they're on site and they live locally. They bring substantial local knowledge to the creation and implementation of management actions for recovery plants, such as changes in flowering and fruiting times, plant responses to fire, observations of pollinating species, even things like grazing pressure. And they bring a broad range of skills to the co-design and implementation of these recovery plans. I have worked with community-based environmental groups whose members are skilled in advocacy, small group facilitation, habitat restoration, the publication of field guides, social media, plant ID, ecology and fire management. The list goes on. And sometimes these members play key roles that other organisations simply cannot, particularly on the advocacy front. So in summary, community-based environmental groups provide the perfect conduit to develop and implement on-ground programs to conserve some of our rarest plants. So, what can actually help them get the job done? Training, especially training that underpins and strengthens their capacity to implement recovery work, offers of guidance, direction, expertise, and the provision of information when they are needed, and of course offered in a spirit of collaboration. An opportunity to contribute to a wider goal, to make a difference, to do something meaningful, to see their efforts recognised and valued, to be taken seriously as partners in the conservation effort. Access to resources including the latest conservation science and practice, and access to information including expert information on species ecology, taxonomy, ecological restoration, things like the spatial records of threatened species and the temporal records of disturbance events like wildfire. A willingness and a collaborative attitude from experts and specialists to partner with them. Renewal, especially new group members, and time. As we know, community-based environmental groups are made up of volunteers, often retired or working full-time, and they don't operate under the same timeframes as public servants or NGOs. That doesn't mean they want to see change happen slowly. It's often quite the reverse. So many of these needs provide important entry and connection points for the threatened plant network, contributing to what the network does and how it can bring about a coordinated response to threatened plant conservation. So just some examples. So currently the network provides training in threatened flora surveys, negotiating the permitting process, and plan ID. So modest beginnings in this regard, but the call for survey training has certainly resonated with community groups right across the state. For example, the network recently worked with Native Plants Capricornia to provide survey training to interested groups in the Rockhampton region. As part of the field component, participants expanded the number of known individuals of an undescribed species. While the mainstay of these workshops is certainly skilling up participants, they are a very real opportunity for community groups to connect with new members in the local area and to renew their ranks. Recognising effort. As you know, many threatened plant species in Queensland are under-surveyed. In addition, baseline data on population size is really fundamental to being able to actually implement recovery action plans. A core component of the network's activity is to organise and coordinate survey effort that provides information on data-deficient species, new threatened flora populations, and threat-based information that can be used to improve and refine actions in recovery plans. For example, the network recently worked with the Wildflower Consortium and QPWS to survey a listed phibalium that was thought to be extinct in Queensland. Almost 1,000 plants were found, with the ensuing report providing really important information to the CAM assessment for this species. Not only do these surveys tap into and rely on local knowledge, but they also contribute to a substantial resume of community-based conservation experience and achievements. This in turn lays the grounds for grant applications, for direct engagement by government agencies and other third parties in community-led project work. Access to resources. The network is currently working with Quandamooka on Minjerribah or North Stradey Island in southeast Queensland to develop a recovery plan for the critically endangered swamp daisy, a species endemic to the island with less than 30 individuals remaining. The daisy faces myriad threats, but by working in collaboration with local traditional owners, the network can bring to bear the historical hydrological, fire management and ecological studies that are key to addressing these threats. Access to information. The network is also working with the Australian Tropical Herbarium to develop a recovery plan for tassel ferns found in North Queensland. Many of these species, as many of you would know, are so rare that the managers responsible for looking after their habitats often know very little actually about them. Furthermore, any available information on these species is limited to a very small group of botanists who have listed source populations, described their threats, and assembled baseline information on their population. Facilitating access to this type of information is a key role for the network. So what are the implications here for the growth and expansion of the Queensland Threatened Plant Network? As I stated earlier, research institutes, NRM groups and governments have the real opportunity to engage with community groups working on species recovery as their core business, with commensurate funding and recognition of the huge multiplier effect across effort, time and dollar value that these groups give to conservation. Effective communication and extension support is a real key to lasting relationships and cooperation. While this should be a given, sometimes it's not. And as an absolute minimum, this needs to be sustained for the same periods of time that we set for actually implementing recovery plans. Preparedness. We all know you can't fast track the development of an environmental consciousness. Yes, groups like the Wildflower Consortium are a really good model for recovery efforts in the locations where we can find them. But assessing where groups are at in terms of their preparedness to take on new activities or roles is absolutely critical. Developing a connection to people in place is also truly vital. From my viewpoint, connection is measured by honesty, practical support, the sharing of expertise, and a sensitivity to the community's specific conservation concerns. That's almost impossible for one person to do across the state, particularly as large as Queensland when you consider the flora and the groups involved. But a network of flora conservation officers could do the job. And lastly, maintaining community ownership, particularly of community conservation outcomes, is absolutely critical, not just for preserving the longevity of these outcomes, but as a basis for developing activities that are seen as relevant and beneficial locally. Thank you. got time for about one question for Jen or myself. David. Thanks, David.
Thanks. Well, this is probably to both of you, I guess. Jen, you mentioned there's about 285 declining species which is suspected or inferred. How much of that's actually, and I guess the inference or suspicion is based on observations, but is it based, how much of that's actually based on monitoring? How much monitoring can you actually start doing which is going to be effective, you think? And I guess it's an issue across Australia, of course, not just within Queensland. When you say 285, your suspicion is probably a lot greater than that.
Yeah, so that figure was, I went through a spreadsheet of the 1,043 species and went through and looked at herbarium collections and conservation advices and talked to people where I could, and quite a few of them have come through the Species Technical Committee while I've been on that. So it was basically, the vast majority, it was unknown. I guess the ones where decline was inferred, it really was due to threats. So, yeah, those threats, I think it's difficult to say because a lot of the time trends are unknown, but you can infer decline if there is a substantial threat observed, like a lack of recruitment or feral pigs that are known to be eating the propagules or the tubers of the plant, or, you know, imminent habitat loss due to urban development or agriculture. So yeah, I suspect to know that there are declines happening, you need monitoring data, and I think I know it's hard, but we should be doing a better job on that. There's just so few species that have got time series monitoring data, and as we saw from the Threatened Species Index, you know, that index is comprised of such a small number of plants. I think there's only 3 in Queensland that have got that, and
I was going to ask that.
yeah, it's pretty small. So we really should be, and I'm obviously, I have a guilty conscience about this too. we should be doing more long-term monitoring to be able to assess trends, and we'd just be in such a better state now. And that's why I loved Caroline's talk yesterday. I thought to have those data for a species is so rare, isn't it? Like, that sort of longevity of monitoring is what we need, and we don't have it for the vast majority of plants.
Yeah, I guess, I think Caroline said there was 108 or something, I think, which are in the Threatened Species Index currently. And there's about 1,400 listed across Australia. So it's a incredibly low proportion, really. And I guess those are the only ones which we have reasonable monitoring data on, which is a reflection, I guess, across Australia, again, that we don't have a lot of decent monitoring data on a lot of species.
Well, and a lot of species, like the ones that I've got monitoring data for in the index, they're ones that are like 1 or 2 populations, and you can do a complete census and grid them up. A lot of things, your observations are like, oh, there's recruitment and I can't see any threats happening, and I'll probably just come and check on it again in another 5 or 10 years next time I'm in that area. So monitoring is such a broad term that I think we need to really prioritise which species need that effort. And I think the CAM process that all the states are going through at the moment and bringing together all the information we know in one place is going to be really helpful for getting a good list and going, right, we're going to really focus on the critically endangered plants, or, whatever prioritisation we're going to use. Because obviously we can't do, when you look at Western Australia, there's the listed species and then there's the priority ones. And yeah, you actually have threatened flora conservation officers over there, which is a big step in the right direction, I think. If we could have something like that where you have people focused on regions and that's their job, I think that's the way forward, and that Western Australian model's been really successful in doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.